We'll sit here.
This one, yeah?
No.
No, where's the other one?
No.
Yeah, charging? Not charging?
Right. I think we're going to get started. First of all, thank you all for coming. So I'm Tony. I work here at Fjord, part of Accenture. And basically this is a series that we are trying to start. It's called First Draft, and we try to get people in from industry, great people like Mark, to basically talk about what's going on and just share it with the wider design community and with the community that we have here at Fjord and Accenture in general. We had a few technical difficulties, as always, with these events. So what used to be a live stream on, I think YouTube, is now on Facebook.
No, still YouTube.
It's still YouTube, nice. So
But mobile now.
You're welcome to. And then obviously, like after the talk, the books over there, and I hope they're gonna put some good inscriptions. Not like nice to meet you, but a bit more than that. But besides that, I just wanted to have Polly introduced. So she will be our master of ceremonies tonight, kind of leading the evening, and then also guiding the Q&A discussion in the end. So over to you.
Cool. All right, so welcome to Fjord. We're a global design agency. We've got around 26 plus studios around the world. We work on design innovation, and we're specialists in the service design sector. So we'd love to introduce you to our space tonight. We moved in March, I think, so it's quite new for us. And as you can tell, we love our home. We want to have as many people here with us as possible for different events. There's hashtags for today's event. They're over on the wall up there. So campaign for authentic leadership, as well as stealing from the future. One of them's up here. And rather than me go on, we'll go to the Q&A later. I'll take you through some sort of formalities for that. But I'd like to introduce you to Mark Curtis here, who actually set up Fjord. So talk about it much more eloquently than me.
Thank you, Holly. I should be clear, I set up Fjord with two other people. Olof Shebergson, as we're speaking Finn, he's not here right now, because he's just come back from Dublin, and Mike Beeston, who's probably knowing Mike currently in the Congo. He left Fjord when we sold the company to Accenture 5.5 years ago, and is now microfinancing businesses in the world's second poorest country. Not an easy or safe place to do business, so fairly amazing people, both Olof and Mike. So I feel like I'm representing both of them. And I mentioned them because back in '93, I met with this chap, Mike Beeston, who's now probably in the Congo, and we got obsessed with what was happening with what we then called new media. and set up a company in London called CHBI. We sold, to cut a long story short, we sold that to Razorfish in 1998. Didn't really look back from there, and then we set up Fjord together with Olaf in 2001. So we're now here. We've been going for, 17 years. We have 80 years actually, Holly, and they keep breeding. Like coat hangers, when you close the cupboard and you come back, there's more coat hangers. It's a bit like that with our studios over the last 2 or 3 years. And that, again, we've been supercharged by being part of Accenture. And we're now about 1,000 designers, so we're probably the largest design and innovation kind of unit in the world. We don't run around saying that a lot outside, because size is not the point, quality is the point. So in 97, this man walks into our life, and Mike and I both recognised a quality of insanity which we held dear immediately, and Neil has proved to be, I mean, he was then and has gone on being just outstandingly visionary. There were some rough edges around his vision early on. And in particular, there was a legendary trip on a big, the Oriana, where they held something called the Marketing Forum, where basically agencies got to meet clients, and we spent all of our marketing budget for the year on just going on this boat. So Neil and I sat on this boat meeting clients. And I remember one particular dinner we had with Britannia Music, and I love this story partly because you had to work quite hard to go back and think what Britannia Music was. Those of you who are old enough, and not all of you are old enough to know, and in fact some of you won't even understand what I'm talking about when I talk about Britannia Music. I'm looking at you, Lucia. And Britannia Music was basically something that advertised on the back pages of the colour magazines Sundays in the UK, and you would sign up to a subscription, usually through slightly covert means, which would then deliver you unstoppably CDs for the rest of your life. Or in fact, initially it was cassettes and then CDs. So, and this business was really huge. I mean, they sponsored the Brit Awards at the time. And Neil sat there on this boat and basically pretty solemnly said to this guy, unless you listen to what I'm going to tell you, your business is dead in 5 years. And he was completely right. He was just a little bit arrogant about it.
And it was exactly 5 years.
But, but the interesting thing was, not what Neil said, he might have maybe softened the message a bit, but he was absolutely right, nailed it, that music was about to get completely turned on its head, and this business of selling unstoppable subscriptions to CDs on the back of Sunday Times magazines was clearly about to die. And I, loved working with Neil ever since. He and I parted ways professionally when we started Fjord, and Neil started to do consulting. And here he is together with Mark to talk about what they're doing at Holos and then to introduce their book. So I haven't met Mark before, I'll confess to you, which is why most of my subject matter has been Neil.
And usually it's, don't worry, it's fine.
And there are many, many more colourful stories I can tell you, but I'm not going to now. Mark impressed me immediately earlier on when I chatted to him and found out what he'd done before, largely because he spent 6 years of his life in the army, and I cannot imagine a better background for partnering with Neil. and later on in the conversation, he said basically, Neil's the visionary in the face, and I'm the integrator, and I can see that completely. And all good, mental and business partnerships, I think, have that blending of the skills. So I'm looking forward to hearing more from both of you and to understand more about what's going to be in your book. I mean, I know some of what's in the book, but I'm very, very excited and just completely honoured and privileged to have you here launching your book. So tell us all about it.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Holly. Thank you all for coming here. It's so fantastic. Some people I've known for a very long time, some people I've worked with quite deeply, and it's just fantastic you're all here, so thank you. We had a couple of questions that we wanted to start with, just to help us sort of calibrate a little bit. So I'd just like a show of hands for people in the room who are members of the Holos faculty. 3, 4, 5? Yeah, 5? Fantastic. Okay, thank you. And who here is a client in some form, either as a corporate client or coaching or
Just
something
walked
like
in.
that?
I am. That's making an entrance.
I'm going to go in or work. So great. Coaching, clients, that sort of thing. Yeah, fantastic. A few of you. Fantastic. So lovely to have you here. Thank you. Mark, did you have some questions?
Who is currently experiencing some degree of change? No. And so, who is currently experiencing some degree of change as a consequence of that big change in their personal life as well as their professional life? They're kind of getting integrated, aren't they? So we wanted to create a platform where people can understand the forces behind these changes to a much more crystal clear degree. And that's where we wanted to start with picking it on.
So I think it's easy to argue that there are far too many leadership books already in the world. But the evidence is that in spite of all of those books, we're still not terribly good at it. And therefore, there must be something missing in all of that learning that is not enabling leadership to really get practiced. And I think what we see in the world is actually a chronic misunderstanding of leadership. I think there's plenty of evidence of that in the political sphere at the moment, but there's also plenty of evidence in the corporate world. And that's the ground that we've ended up playing in. We have been extraordinarily privileged over the last 10 years or so to work with literally thousands of leaders around the world. And every single one of them has contributed to the learning that hopefully we have filtered into this book. So we're also supremely grateful to all those leaders for all of that learning.
And a lot of the people who are in this room, indeed, because that learning doesn't change. It continues every single day with the people that we work alongside, with our faculty, with our clients. Just through having a client conversation, all of that learning continues and continues all the time. But the context that we work inside now, that everybody works inside now, is this idea of constant change. And when Neil and I met in 2010, Neil?
Yes.
I think probably 2010. I want to say on a beach in Rio, but that would give you the wrong impression.
There was a beach in Rio.
It was a beach in Rio, yes. We were in Rio, we were on a job for BP. And we took a long walk along this lovely beach, and we were talking about the things that we had in common and what we were sharing about our knowledge about leadership and change and our experiences through life. And what we realised during that conversation and subsequently was actually all of the modelling for organisational change, all of the ways that organisations currently approach that is probably no longer fit for purpose. And we cast around after that, and we did some reading and we did some research, and we were asking all our very learned colleagues, and we came up short. There is no handbook for constant change until now. He said rather arrogantly.
Well, the previous thoughts around change were that you would go from one steady state to another steady state, and the change was that the process of going from one to the other. And what we see now is actually quite a different environment, where because of the three megatrends that we talk about, digitization, decarbonisation and ageing, because of those three megatrends, that change cycle is quite different. And actually what organisations have to do is not go from one steady state to a different steady state, but to be able to be effective at being reliable and sort of cranking that handle to make the profits and generate the income, and at the same time deliver effective, skillful transformation in parallel alongside each other. And most conventional organisations, at least, aren't set up for that. Most conventional organisations have prioritised management rather than leadership over a period of perhaps 50 or 100 years. Management being fundamentally about reliability and leadership being fundamentally about change.
So how do we get from there to a book? And I think the answer to that is organically and interdependently. And we'll come back to that word interdependent in a second. The other thing we want to talk about is authenticity. So in a world, frightening things are happening, frankly, and no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, these things are happening fast, they are happening with very, very severe impact, and they are happening with increasingly frequent regularity. So this is just some headlines from The Guardian on Monday of this week. And Neil spoke just briefly about the 3 megatrends that are affecting everything across the world currently. Those are digitisation, the digitalisation of everything, decarbonisation, this energy transition that we're working on, and ageing, which is a physical dynamic which is happening in population. Now there's an impact to those 3 things, and it's all emerging in the social fabric. And what we have noticed and researched as we've approached the book is that those impacts in the social fabric are not being talked about as much as they need to be, and they're having impacts that are completely unforeseen and unanticipated. So all of those things are represented up on here. So we've got The Guardian, who is creating new ways to hold its head aloft in a time when newspapers are failing. They're funding themselves in different ways. We've got this big issue of plastics, which is affecting everybody, and we think, well, if we recycle our plastic in a different way, then so much won't go into the sea, and it's not going to be quite so bad, or is it? And you can look along here, you can see each of these having cause and effect, particularly in the energy transition in here. So what happens in the oil industry tends to affect everybody. So anything you want to
Well,
say?
I think we often like to imagine that the abundance and wealth that we enjoy as a society is the result of our human brilliance. But mostly it's the result of burning ancient sunlight. And that process of burning ancient sunlight is going to come to an end within most of our lifetime. So that's a huge transition, this shift from an addiction to fossil fuels to something else.
So there are 2 main concepts at the heart of our book. We want to talk just briefly about the book, and then we're going to move on to something else which we feel is much more about the future and are actually much more sustainable. So I'll talk about this concept, and Neil's going to talk about the other. So the first concept that we want to talk about is this: what was that model for constant change that we eventually came up with? So here, effectively, what you've got is a table, and the table describes the state of the organisation that you might be in now. So if you're in an organisation, something up here will probably resonate with you. Actually, it's probably also going to happen if you're in a family, or if you're in a social group, or in any other thing that you might want to take part in, a social club or a sports club or something like that. There are 4 main states: fixed, ability, ownership, and adaptability. And usually the chief execs and the senior leaders that we meet on a regular basis, what they want to do is they want to be adaptable, and they want to get there straight away, and they want to do it next year. But unfortunately, they're probably in fix. And it takes quite a long time, thank you for nodding, I appreciate that. It takes quite a long time to get from fix to adaptability. And what typically, because we're human and we want the shortest route, what we think we can do is leapfrog over everything and get there straight away, but we can't, unfortunately. So what we have to do is move our organisation up through those different stages in order to reach that. The management era that Neil talked about was this era of reliability. This is where management is the thing which you need. You need efficient processes, you need great products, you need to be able to do that very frequently, very often, and you need to be able to make a reliable profit off the back of that. In usual circumstances, reliability is the goal. But if you're just reliable now, you've probably only got a transactional business. And therefore what you need to create is an adaptability, because reliability, something will happen that will change your business probably from the outside, and you'll lose that reliability. So we have to become both reliable and adaptable, all in the same moment, somehow. The stage between reliability and adaptability is a cultural stage. Because in reliable organizations, what they have is high degrees of compliance, high degrees of control. They have systems and processes you have to follow. If you don't follow those systems and processes, you're marked out as specialists and can probably do a career-limiting move before too long. In those situations, what we need is management. Leadership is quite annoying, but we need leadership to get up to the top. So on the right-hand side of this, we've got this second column here, which talks about the bandwidth or the attention, the focus of attention that leadership has across an organisation. And in order to move from one to the next, you can't be operating here. So if you're in an organisation that is in a condition of fix, with people running around with their hair on fire, to only focus on goals and tasks is going to keep you there. You need to be operating from a leadership perspective from the level above in order to raise the standard of the organisation. The aim for the leadership is to create time, space and opportunity for what we've called the VUCA response to a VUCA world. Who knows what VUCA is? Yeah, VUCA, what is it? Please shout it out. Volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. These are the conditions that we live and work inside every day. So how do you lead in that context? And one of the things that we've tried to codify is that approach. And we call it VUCA, which is about vision, innovation and inspiration, collaboration and accountability. So in this model, what we've attempted to provide is a template for how to deal with the state of constant change. And it's not either or. We don't need either reliability or adaptability. We need them both. And the crucial aspect of that is the culture that you have, which is ownership.
Yeah. So we tease apart these two words, management and leadership. And when what you're trying to create is reliability, then management is what you require. And as Mark said, leadership is annoying because leadership implies change. And if what you're trying to create is reliability, then of course someone coming along and changing stuff is going to be annoying. And so actually many organisations have discouraged leadership. Actively, okay, see nodding. They actively discourage leadership because it creates this disruption. But in an environment where you want the organisation to be adaptable, you need the reliability, but you also need the change. So you need leadership, but not any old kind of leadership. And I think we started this by saying leadership was misunderstood. And I think a lot of the reason that leadership is misunderstood is because we use this word to mean so many different things. And it's confusing. We don't get to understand it. What we've hopefully done is teased this word leadership apart into four different leadership styles. By far the most common form of leadership in human history is what we would call boss-style leadership. Primarily motivated by status and operating typically at an organisation or team level. Boss-style leaders are quite popular in organisations because they achieve results quite quickly. The problem is that they only achieve results by stealing from the future. They only achieve results by stealing from the future. What we mean by stealing from the future is they appropriate value that is someplace ahead and they bring it into the present. If you think about that in the terms of a factory, for example, if you're a factory manager or a factory boss and you've got a target to achieve some results and you cut down on maintenance for a year because that's going to help you achieve your targets, then you're stealing from the future, aren't you? Because that cost is going to happen sometime. What very often happens is that bosses just move on to another job before the costs arrive. But I heard on the radio this morning the NHS talking about me trying to meet their targets, and they have literally cut down on the maintenance of the hospitals. The cost doesn't go away, it's just been stolen from the future. So bosses do that. The other thing that bosses do, which again probably you'll recognise, is that bosses prioritise loyalty over competence. Bosses prioritise loyalty over competence. They would rather you just did what you were told and supported them and did whatever they wanted you to do than actually had your own creative ideas or actually could really challenge what they were thinking of doing. But I'm sure we're very familiar with this style of leadership because it is the most common in human history. Somewhat similar to bosses are rulers. Rulers aren't, it's important that we don't think of rulers as just sort of uber bosses. They're not, they're different. And the thing that makes bosses different from rulers is that they arrive at the top fully formed. They don't go up through the ranks like the rest of us. They kind of just start at the top. So think about people like Rupert Murdoch or Donald Trump. You know, they didn't go up through the ranks. They were just there at the top. And again, rulers steal from the future, and status is what drives them, and loyalty is more important than competence. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just think about the Trump's White House, if you know competence. So somewhat similar to, surprisingly similar to rulers, are visionaries. Both rulers and visionaries, nightmare to work for. Rulers, because of the extreme loyalty that they demand and the quality of loyalty that they demand. Visionaries, because they somehow expect everyone else to be like them. They have ridiculously high standards. Think about Elon Musk or Steve Jobs. So visionaries, and again, like rulers, visionaries arrive at the top fully formed. They don't go up through the ranks. They start at the top. Does that make sense? We don't come across rulers and visionaries very, very often. They're very rare. But it's really important that we understand understand what they're like, because they have such a disproportionate impact on the system. They operate at a system level. Absolutely, the sweet spot for leadership in most organizations is authentic leadership. Authentic leaders generate results. What authentic leaders do is they create sustained success. They don't steal from the future, and they create sustained success by enabling people to be the very best version of themselves. So bosses don't want competence, they want loyalty. They don't care whether you're yourself or not, they just want you to be loyal to them. Authentic leaders want you to be the very, very best version of yourself, and they'll help you to be that.
What examples are there of authentic leaders in your eyes?
Well, so the interesting thing about authentic leaders is that they don't have big egos. So they don't come up big. But there are some. In my first books, I wrote about several of them. So Tim Mead, who was the founder of Yo Valley, he's a good example. Or Richard Reed, the founder of Innocent.
Jose Mujica.
Jose Mujica, the former president of Uruguay. There are some good authentic leaders around, but they don't have the big egos. So they don't shout about it too much. The weird thing in all of this is that although boss-style leadership is by far the most common in human history, most people who show up as bosses aren't actually authentically bosses at all. They just don't know any better. They're under pressure, they're stressed. They're just reacting from not their best place. They've never had a good authentic leader as a role model. If you've ever had a really good leader to work for, and Mike was certainly a fantastic example when I worked at Razorfish. If you've ever had a really good authentic leader as your line manager, you will absolutely know about it. Underneath all of this, there's these words here: self-dependent, independent, interdependent, and integral. And they refer to maturity levels. And maturity levels are quite important here. Has anyone come across spiral dynamics? Yeah, a couple of people. So back in the 50s, a guy called, an American neurosurgeon called Claire Graves, confusingly a man, noticed that there were physiological differences in people's brains at different stages of development. He actually started out by noticing difference between Republicans and Democrats, between their brain structure. And he came to articulate spiral dynamics. This is another version of that. But what it says is that we go through stages of development, emotional development and maturity, starting with self. So as infants, we operate from a self level of maturity where the world exists to serve us. It's all about me. And as parents, of course, we reinforce that. And about 2% of the adult population never mature beyond. We have special names for them. They're called psychopaths and narcissists.
Or presidents.
Or presidents, in some cases. At about 5 or 6, or 4, 5, 6, we mature to a dependent level of maturity. So that whole process of the terrible twos is that maturing process. And we get to this dependent level of maturity where we're not terribly good at taking the initiative, we like rules and structures, fairness is really important, and about 17% of the adult population never move beyond dependent. And we've probably come across them, people in the workplace who are unable to take any initiative, they just need to be told what to do. In our late teens, typically, we mature to a level of independence, where it's me and people like me against the world. Very much a sort of gang mentality. and where it's, we're competing with everyone else, everything is competition. And about 40% of the adult population never mature beyond independent. So this is Trump's base, this is Brexit, and then most of us, or not most of us, about 40% of us, another 40% of us, in our late 20s, mature to an interdependent level of maturity, where trust and vulnerability go hand in hand, and where we're able to create real collaboration, real teamwork. Real teamwork doesn't exist yet. Real teamwork only exists at an interdependent level, and you can see that the body much operates in that independent space. And then about 1% of the adult population get as far as integral, where that sense of interdependence isn't just between people, but it's actually between species, and it's over both the future and the past. And but the interesting thing, the trick here, is that however wonderfully large our perspective is, however mature we are all vulnerable to being triggered right back down to here. When things don't go our way, when the person in the call centre says no, when the technology doesn't work, we are all vulnerable to being triggered. And maybe we get triggered back to being independent. We start competing with each other, we stop collaborating. Or maybe we get triggered back to dependent. Just tell me what to do. I can't figure it out. So this model is really, or these two models really underpin our whole theory of leadership, our whole approach to leadership, and both are articulated more in the book. He's an authentic leader. He's not a visionary. He was a president. So was Jose Mujica.
But it's interesting because neither Trump or Steve Bannon view Obama as a leader of any sort.
Yes. But that's the other thing.
They're on record as criticising him as not being a leader.
Yeah. So bosses and rulers don't regard authentic leaders as leaders at all. What they see is weakness, not leadership.
So actually that brings us to the bit here which could be about the sustainable part of this. Books are only a moment in time. They're the sort of the combination of the accumulation of a thinking process that's happened over the previous 10, 15 years. We have a moment in time, but as soon as that book is published, it's out of date. There are things in that book which hopefully if you buy it a bit later, you will read about and you'll think, well, this week that changed because it was all about Brexit. So what's the piece that then can move on afterwards? How do authentic leaders galvanize and organize in order to provide some sort of counterpoint to what's going on? Do we actually need that? So what's typical of bosses and rulers is that they will self-organize and they will create monolithic structures and organizations that are in their image. We probably all existed inside one at some point. They are also quite slavish about the kind of behavior and obedience that we need in order to be successful within that organization, which is partly why, as Neil was talking about, lots of people who are authentic really struggle inside those organizations. This is me, it's a I don't really enjoy being here because I have to earn some money, some familiar feelings in the room and stuff. Now, can anybody tell me, or has anybody ever experienced an organization where authentic leadership self-perpetuated and extended beyond the end of your tenure in that organization? We couldn't think of one. And I'm seeing lots of people going, yeah. So, the really exciting bit, I think, about this, about what we're attempting to create, and with this mind, to create something called the Campaign for Authentic Leadership. We believe and hope that it could be some kind of movement, a bit like Me Too or Black Lives Matter. And what we want to do is we want to provide a forum where authentic leaders, people who believe the same thing that we believe, would like to come together to share stories, to celebrate successes, to talk about the things that are important to them, and to perpetuate that style of leadership because we need it. In 2015, I went to Delhi, New Delhi, and I studied under Al Gore to become a climate reality leader. And I was so overwhelmed by that process, I couldn't do it for 6 months. It shocked me to my core and really challenged me around the future of our species. Not just our species, but many other species across the world. And as we know, there is a large extinction event happening right now. Without authentic and integral leadership, we're really not sure if we're going to be here in 3, 4, 5 months. Now, I'm really going to embarrass you. I'm so sorry, Steve, but I'm going to call out somebody in this room who has just been an authentic leader and done something absolutely. I think this typifies the kind of person may want to join us. So Steve works inside the leadership team of our client partner, a lab digital agency. They help us to do our website and things. He's a good friend. And he recently ran 21 marathons in 21 days and raised £165,000 for his beloved charity.
Yeah.
Steve, would you mind saying a little bit about it?
Naomi House are a children's hospital down in Hampshire that provide respite care provide through this. And I've been involved with the charity now for 14. This year they celebrated their 20th. So I wanted to do something big to help celebrate that and to raise some much needed funds towards the £8.5 million a year that we need to put the key in the door.
And you have to search for me if you believe in authenticity. Just join us on LinkedIn or tell us that you want to become involved, and we'll encourage you. And that's where it is. So we've already got a link to the page, and the hashtag is already existing.
Is there a short version of the hashtag?
Not yet. It could be.
Yeah, it's a great challenge. I think what we wanted was something that said what it was, and I understand the need for brevity in our current age, but actually I quite like that it's really long and difficult because it makes you write it.
Takes some commitment. Our vision as an organisation for Holos may seem a little ambitious, but our vision is universal authentic leadership. We would like all leadership in education, in business, in government to be authentic. And the thing about it is, it's a choice. It's just a choice that we make as a society. What we want you to do, what we'd like everyone to do, is to stop following bosses. Stop following rulers. Work on being an authentic leader yourself. And we can make that choice. We don't have to be led by bosses and rulers. So,
To finish off, we thought it might be nice just for us to read our kind of favourite bit from the book. Would that be all right? So Neil's going to do a small bit, and I'm going to do a small bit.
we're doing that way around.
Yes, go for it. Is that all right?
Okay. This is a passage on exercising leadership. The very instant we decide to take responsibility for some sort of change, and someone chooses to follow or is influenced by us, we are leading. We've all done this at some point in our lives, at least during a childhood game. When we do it repeatedly, on an increasing scale, and with some wider strategic intent, we're developing our leadership. Just because you show leadership, you may not be a leader. And even when you have the hierarchical responsibility, you can and should switch roles to manage, follow, learn, or be a team player when relevant. What makes leadership behaviour consistent is a disciplined focus on standards in the pursuit of a shared cause and conditions to achieve the cause. There is an almost universal challenge in the way organisations appoint leaders. In most organisations, management and leadership are the only routes to promotion. It is exceptional to offer a pure expert route where people can be promoted for their technical skill without having oversight and responsibility of other people. Universities and some manufacturing and a small number of engineering businesses promote experts, but it's unusual. In addition, expert routes rarely offer equivalent remuneration and status to leadership routes, yet our organisations habitually intertwine expertise with leadership. In business, people are generally promoted because they become expert at something, like design or accounting. Once expert enough, that individual is promoted to lead teams of designers or accountants. So far, so good. But deep in our limbic brain, we need to feel a sense of self-worth and inclusion. So when our role requires an expertise we don't really have, such as leadership, and we're poorly supported to learn and develop, we tend to retreat and spend our time on the expertise that got us promoted in the first place, the design or accountancy skills that give us that sense of self-worth. As a result, leadership activity is pushed to the side of our desk, and we typically feel very stretched and risk micromanaging the expertise and underperforming on leadership.
So Neil's an established author. I have been, since the age of 17, wanting to publish a book. So for 35 years, mathematicians, that makes me 52. No, I'm 51. So for 34 years, this has been a dream of mine. So a bit of a realisation, I won't mind rereading from my afterword. And my afterword is not strictly linked to the full content of the book, but it is about me. So the book has been, for the most part, an illustration of a rational and reasonable case for authentic leadership. And it's a handbook for sustained, agile change. Our overwhelming intent has been to create a sense of possibility about tackling these difficult issues. Although the book deals with the emotional transition through everyday change, the narrative has not addressed the vast subterranean grief and hopelessness that many feel about the slow build-up of the threats to the world. In 2018, we are in the middle of an extinction event as grave as that which occurred 65 million years ago. This extinction event is unique because it has been brought about by us. And it is all the more troubling because governments and blocs are not acting quickly enough to stop the destruction. It is not just the environment that is under threat, but our own food chains and hence our very ability to sustain our growing numbers. Throughout writing, events across the world have moved at a pace we could not keep up with. This evidenced itself both in positive stories to mitigate and ameliorate pressing global challenges, and in retrograde or backward steps. They all relate to leadership. For example, both the election of Trump and the vote for Brexit occurred after we had written early drafts. If the issues were pressing in 2015, how much more pressing are they now? The crisis of leadership we face goes way beyond voting in another set of decision makers. It reaches into our own lives and choices with two penetrating questions. What are you prepared to do? What are you prepared not to do? Thank you very much.
So we do have some books for sale. In keeping with the technological challenges this evening, the credit card reads not working. So we can take cash payments, and we will also just take names and addresses and send invoices out for those who haven't got cash.
Well, thank you both very much. Lots and lots of food for thought there. I'd like to ask questions to get started off, and then questions from the floor or from the live stream as well. What would be your top 3 tips to start being more of an authentic leader on a daily basis? Difficult one.
Can I start?
Yeah.
I think trust yourself is the first thing that I would say. A lot of the people that I work with around organisations, and surprisingly frequently in senior positions, don't have very much self-worth, or it's been battered in some way. And so I think the first step in authenticity is trusting yourself, trusting that your instincts and that your preferences are actually okay.
I'm going to put a 0 step before that,
Okay.
which is get to know you. So actually spend some time figuring out who you are, what matters to you, what your drivers are. Then trust yourself. And then I guess the third one based on that would be act. You can't power field by turning it over your mind. You can't change the world from your bedroom. You've got to get out there. And leadership is interesting actually. Leadership's often talked about as being lonely. I think if leadership is lonely, you're doing it wrong. Leadership's a team sport. So get out there with people and lead.
Excellent. So any questions burning in people's minds at the moment? Oh, in back, Robert.
Firstly, thank you very much for the talk, it's very interesting. My question is, how do you square the dream of not following leaders with the cultural and political leaning towards individualism, which could be convincingly argued as the root of a lot of the issues that we face today in society and culture? So
we're not saying don't follow leaders, we're saying don't follow bosses or rulers. It's an interesting one on this so-called individualism. I had a conversation about this very recently, about this idea that somehow younger people are more individualistic than we were. I'm not sure I buy it. I think we were pretty individualistic too. But I think that the difference for me is that younger people are much less willing to sacrifice their own purpose than our generation was. We were much more willing to, I don't know what, sell ourselves out for the dollar. And I think that when people say that, what they mean is that this younger generation are much more purpose-led, and I celebrate that and support it.
To directly answer the question, I think that there's a very interesting phenomenon going on, and that is, in the book we talk about the idea that authentic leadership, or leadership that is making change that is to the benefit of the world, has actually moved outside the mainstream. So the mainstream is playing catch-up in many, many ways, in government, in not so much in business, because business in many ways is leading the way in terms of authenticity, depending on the impact of the business, of course. But if you look around at the amount of lobbying, protest movements, people who are willing to glue their hands to a shop front, all these kinds of people who are doing ocean cleanup, people who are looking to roll back GM, all these kinds of things. There's an organisation called Biomimicry 3.8. They estimate that about 1 million organisations, not people, organisations around the world, are now operating in this sort of world peace space.
If I'm allowed to embarrass another one of our guests. We also have the founder and global head of green banking at Barclays. And Rhiannon created that herself without permission within Barclays. So it's doable.
I think that question links really well back to your campaign for authentic leadership, because I think one reason most people would aspire to be a boss ruler is because that's the narrative, that's the story we hear about success. But if we start to hear other narratives about a different version of success, it gives permission to people to do that.
Yeah, spot on. Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier the 3 sort of megatrends that were influencing it. What do you think about them has really made now the time to be pushing for this authentic leadership movement specifically?
Well, so digitalisation obviously started some time ago, and we were right at the front end of that in the late 90s. And it was clear at the time that that's the direction you needed to go in. And then these other two have come on to compound that. The point is that in a conventional organisation where what you need is reliability, then actually boss style leadership works because actually just getting people to do what they're told can deliver reliability and can deliver it over time. There is stealing from the future, which causes the boom and bust cycles that we get in economies and in businesses. What authentic leadership does that boss leadership doesn't do is authentic leadership allows creativity. So an organisation like Fjord, actually, I find it hard to imagine that creative agencies can really operate with boss style leadership terribly well at all. They actually have to have authentic style leadership. What you see in more conventional businesses is that they haven't had it in the past and they need it now. Government, of course, is another whole question.
But I think in terms of the megatrends gathering pace, what we notice more and more is the word disruption, which has appeared. We probably see it 25 times a day now when we look in the media, when we look in wherever we get to look on daily, in business presentations and so on and so on. So it's that pace of change which is the new thing. It's the fact that it's constant, and you're still fixing one change while another change is coming along. There's probably another one going to happen tomorrow.
And the other bit of this is that most of us have very poor experiences of change. And arguably, a lot of the trauma that exists in the world today is the result of poorly executed change. And actually, boss-style leaders inherently execute change poorly because change requires high degrees of trust, which they don't create. So authentic style leadership is required to create an adaptable, changeable organisation because it needs trust, which requires authentic leadership.
So do you think people that have, for example, started their own companies and actually build it up from scratch are tending to be more authentic leaders, maybe besides Elon Musk, who goes towards a visionary or Steve Jobs?
I don't think there's any evidence for that. I mean, I think there's a lot of small businesses, family businesses, which are run as ruthless autocracies. So we talk about the difference between intentional and accidental cultures. An intentional culture is one where you specifically design a culture to achieve a purpose. Many small businesses aren't. The only purpose is to enrich the founders. So they're not particularly authentic.
I've got a view that aligns a lot with yours, by the way, and a question that comes out of it. So I really like, and it resonates with me, this developmental stages kind of lens on it, and the fact that you say only a certain percentage move on. Clients I've worked with, their learning and development kind of functions, some have cottoned onto this and they try really, really hard to develop kind of the later stage leadership. I haven't seen many examples where it works really well. So I'd be curious about your view on development within an organizational setting. And the point of appreciation I've got is, and therefore I think the campaign for authentic leadership is genius, because there are people out there already that can unshackle themselves from having to be developed in a way an organisation may or may not wish, that can connect.
So vertical development, which is what you're talking about, as opposed to horizontal development, which is skills development. Vertical development is not easy. I mean, it's reprogramming the brain, restructuring the brain. There's brain plasticity. You can do it, but as an imposed thing, that's really tough. We worked with a client recently where we've been briefed heavily, as we always are, and we really had developed the view that they were largely at this independent space. We have a profiling tool. We ran this profiling tool with them. And they showed up as interdependent, and we were pretty confused because actually our experience of them was that they were independent, and our briefing was that they were independent. And what we realized was that the action of walking in the door of their office triggered them from here to here. When they were at home with their families, when they were in their communities, they operated from an interdependent space. The moment they walked in the door, they became independent. So I think actually a lot of this idea of vertical development is somewhat bogus, because in most cases, I think most people are already, certainly if we're talking about the corporate environment, very few people are genuinely here. What they need is to have the stress taken away from them, have the triggers taken away from them, to allow them to be the best version of themselves, which requires authentic leadership.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Message from, question for Mark,
Yeah.
really. Bearing in mind your previous role, how do you think this model relates to military?
Well, that's a really good question, because the military, you would imagine, if you're not in the military, is very hierarchical, is extremely controlling, and you have to be put into a box.
In certain contexts it is.
Absolutely. Are you ex-military?
I've got some experience.
Okay. When somebody says that, when somebody says that, very special.
I come from the military family.
Okay, military family. Yeah. Actually, the best leadership lessons I've ever learned came from the military. So interdependence at an extremely high level, where you have to know a team. If you've got an observation post which is overlooking one of the crossing points in the province of Northern Ireland, and you're sitting there for 3 days in a hedge with 4 other people and rotating who's looking at the crossing point, you've got to know each other pretty well. because you've got little plastic bags to do your business in, and all this sort of stuff. So the ethic of team working and actually the stripping away of appointed authority happens in those environments. And a lot of the lessons that I have been working with and in many cases struggling to bring into corporate environments because they don't have that same level of adversity, don't operate. Because you go home at 5 o'clock or 8 o'clock. So yes, so I think the window opens in the military, and what you're taught to do is appreciate a situation. So a situation is in front of you, you establish a vision in order to deal with that situation, and you work out how are we going to do this on an interdependent basis. And there's a military maxim, sorry I didn't see your hand up, just to finish this. There's a military maxim which goes something like, no plan survives first contact with execution, which you may have heard before. So no matter how well you plan or how well you put things into boxes beforehand, as soon as the bullets start flying or you put a plan into operation, you have to make changes. And that's the agility that you learn in the military.
I'd love set up plans. I just touched on that, Mark, please. I did, I was 17 years an officer in the army as well. So, one of the points that I think we're spoiled in the military is that we expect everyone to have leadership qualities already. And a lot of this is about not having leader-follower, it's having leader-leader.
Yeah.
And authentic leadership, and we have some pretty poor leaders in the military as well.
There are also poor leaders in the
as it is cross-section of society.
Sure.
But one of the things that that the authentic leaders stand out is because they believe in the leader-leader aspect, and the part of, and some of the occasions when I've been an authentic leader, I can recognise this aspect, is when I've developed my team to also be leaders. And a lot of companies and businesses and posts get to the point where they do their job for when they're in that job. They don't think about what's next.
That's it.
And developing. And my teams went on to be promoted more than others.
Yeah.
And that's when I think, oh, okay, I did a good job. Not necessarily at the time, and not necessarily rewarded at the time.
The
And I think that's the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. The first requirement of leadership is followers. And you can't ask somebody to follow you. They invest you with that authority. So if you're walking around like people I've heard on the media saying, I'm a leader, I'm a very strong leader. No, you're not actually. I don't think you're talking about. You can't claim that. You have to behave in a way so that people go, I'll have some of that.
We're going to take 2 more questions, so perhaps over here and then this one. Was there someone at the back with a hand up for a while? Oh, perhaps if you'd like to go first.
Well, I'm really looking forward to reading the book. Really big congratulations. And I don't want this to seem a down question at all. I'm just curious about how we prevent things just becoming a trend and becoming buzzwords, and actually the action behind it not taking place. I mean, we've seen it with mindfulness and all sorts of things. And I'm fearful coming off the back of the conference where I was chairing lots of events and lots of really not good organisations talking about how they value authentic leadership and quoting Brené Brown all the time. I thought, no, I've seen the people who work on your floors and I know that they are not experiencing that. So what can we do in this campaign to prevent people from just saying, oh yeah, we have this authentic leadership.
Well, it's happened before.
Yeah.
With authentic leadership. I know. I mean, look, it's like anything. It's a question of keeping going and continuing to learn yourself and just staying focused. We want to do a lot with it. We plan to expand the size of our organisation and reach more organisations and work with more people and share the message more broadly. But it's really a question of keeping going.
So one of the things that we focus on in order to directly answer what you've asked there is that, and there are many of them around this room, so it's not us I'm talking about, it's these people, is we only work with authentic leaders to deliver authentic leadership. So our faculty who are peppered around here, have a chat with them, see what they think. There's one right next to you. All right, there we go.
You might just have sunk my question. Sorry if you mentioned it. If you brought this up, I arrived late, so apologies for that. I may have missed it. You mentioned at one point that can you think of examples of authentic leadership? And said, well, we can't. Okay, fine. So do you write about transitioning between the norm, the boss, to authenticity, or do you reckon those of us who are thinking about this all the time and we're wondering why we're in this organisation when we want to be in something else. Should we just jack it in and start our own? I mean, do you transition? Are you transitioning people? Are you saying within an organisation?
Absolutely, yes.
So where are the examples? I mean,
Well,
you said there were no examples.
You could talk to Casey.
No, you said there were no examples, so that's why I'm questioning.
So I mean, I think that the first thing is that we have this conversation about being an authentic leader in lots of organisations where the cultural style is a boss style leader, and so they need to go into that with their eyes wide open. That they will not be seen as leaders necessarily. They've got to figure out how to communicate in the right language, hold on, keep their integrity, and use the right language to have influence and to be respected within the organisation. And that's just part of the journey. So we've got to recognise that, you know, if you're lucky enough to work in an authentic organisation, that's great. If you're not lucky enough, you may choose to bail out, and that's fine. But I know the examples in the room of people who are in organisations which aren't particularly authentic and are able to carve a path through that. It takes considerable courage and dedication. It takes a willingness to continually develop skills, but it's doable. And I would say the key bit is this bit about recognising that boss-style leaders won't recognise you as a leader if you only use that authentic lever. So what language do you use to retain your integrity and have influence? And it's doable. It just takes effort.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Does authentic leaders have the same values? Do they need to have the same values?
As each other?
Kind of, is there a similar kind of set of values?
I guess they would value authenticity and integrity and honesty and truth and stuff like that. But you know, we all have different values. So I would say there are some probably that are consistent. I think you'd have to value integrity and honesty.
Trust.
And trust, yeah.
That would be quite a, I would think there was quite a lot of similarity.
But then there's probably some other different values as well.
Yeah. But if you asked a boss leader what their values were, they would probably say some of the same things.
Yes, your boss-style leader is going to say trust too. But they're going to mean something completely different.
Yes. It means something else. It means, I'll trust you if you give me your loyalty. And if you
Very
don't
conditional kind of trust.
Yeah,
watch out.
Which is not trust.
So I think the answer to the question is in the interdependence. How genuinely interdependent are you working?
Yeah.
Because values everybody shares probably.
It's a chronic thing, you're using a word that's not really that. Yeah.
But of course, if you're operating from an independent mindset, then you can't see that trust means something else to people who are interdependent. That's not even visible to you. Okay, Twitter.
There's still some drinks over there. I'd just like to thank you both again.
Thank you.
So thanks, Tony. Any last?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for coming. This was really interesting, and I'm looking forward to speaking some more afterwards over some drinks and food. I think there's just a few things that I want to mention for everybody that are important. Is you see like there's like blocked off section over here that just because we have some confidentiality within extension, which we have to get to. So if you could just, if you need to use a bathroom, if you haven't already, it's basically that way around. And we have these lovely key cards. Pretty. So basically get in and out, so don't lose them, otherwise you're not going to get back in. Yeah, but that's basically it.
The cards are in the...
Oh yeah, the cards are right there on the corner actually, next to the nice gentleman in the booth. Yeah.
So there's drinks and food, there's books, unfortunately no card payments technology, but we will figure out how to do it. Thank you all so much for coming.
after the